Welcome to this special edition of the CEC Report. It's the 1st of March and I'm Robert Barwick. Today's CEC Report will be a brand new video production called Hyperinflation, a Graphic Presentation on the financial hyperinflation that is destroying the world economy. This video has been produced by the CEC's associates in the United States, the LaRouche Political Action Committee. Lyndon LaRouche, the American physical economist, has forecast for a number of years now that the enormous volume of money printing by central banks since before the GFC in 2008 was sending the world towards a hyperinflationary collapse such as that which destroyed Weimar Germany in 1923. A few weeks ago, in a February 15 webcast, LaRouche announced that the British financial elite recognise that hyperinflation is out of control, so they are moving to collapse the existing currencies and to issue new currency, but only for a select few. This intentional deflationary collapse would accelerate the collapse already underway in the agriculture, manufacturing and infrastructure of the physical economy, to the point where billions of people face mass death. Also in mid-February, one of the most important people in global finance, Bill Gross, who runs the world's largest bond trading company called PIMCO, issued his own warning of hyperinflation. Gross called the current global financial system a credit supernova, which he explained is, quote, a monster that requires perpetually increasing amounts of fuel, a supernova star that expands and expands, yet in the process begins to consume itself. Please watch now as Dennis Small, economics editor of LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review magazine, explains how the present hyperinflationary crisis in the world economy is even greater than Bill Gross admits.
Now, Mr. Gross's graphic is one that we have available here, which he called that of the exploding supernova. And what he shows here simply is the rapid growth of total U.S. credit, which includes household, corporate, and government debt, rising from some $4 trillion back in the 1975 period up to about $55–60 trillion today. And his explanation is that, as you can see from this, it would take $4 of the debt in 1975 per unit of GDP. It's now more in the range of 20. And he described this as a credit supernova. Now, the fact of the matter is that although Gross's argument is interesting and points in the direction of a problem, it actually vastly understates the nature of the hyperinflationary bubble which has been built and which is in the process of exploding today. It is a hyperinflation which has in fact run amok, and we developed the following graphic just to give an idea to you of how much worse it actually is than even Gross's estimation, which is also clear from Gross's own discussion of the matter, because in a footnote to his article he states that he was excluding from consideration in the debt figures what he calls shadow debt. Now, shadow debt is in fact a reference to the existence of an enormous bubble of financial aggregates, of derivatives in particular, which have grown more rapidly than the debt has grown, which has grown more rapidly than the GDP. In other words, the rate of increase of the financial aggregates has been greater by an order of magnitude even than the figures that Mr. Gross chose to present. And what we have here, as you can see in this graphic representation, the blue line, which is down near the x-axis, is actually Gross's figure that I showed you previously of the relationship of debt to GDP. But like they say, that ain't nothing. You need to look at the totality of world financial aggregates, which is principally derivatives, i.e. bets on bets on bets, which has grown in the ratio of those aggregates to the GDP, not fivefold as the gross number indicates on the debt, but has actually grown 50-fold over this period. So that today you have $500 of debt per unit of GDP. Now, what you've got is a situation which is in fact spun completely out of control. First of all, let me point to your attention to what the composition is of those world financial aggregates. Now, you'll notice that these numbers only go through 2005, which is the last time we did a detailed calculation of this. But the total world financial aggregates at that time were close to $1 quadrillion. That's $1,000 trillion, which is as meaningless actually as the total aggregates themselves. But the point that I want to get to here is that the actual world picture of financial aggregates is not made up principally by the stock market, as overvalued as that is. It's not made up principally by the debt, which is what Gross was looking at, of the United States or of all the countries of the third world or all of the other direct debt. The lion's share of this whole thing are financial derivatives. Now, what's a derivative? Good question. Derivatives have been described, I believe accurately, as essentially a way to lie and cover up about a loss which you have suffered financially. So that rather than saying, oh my gosh, I'm bankrupt, I can't pay that debt, what you say instead is, no, I'll make another bet to cover that loss in the hopes that eventually I won't have to pay that increased loss coming from the derivatives bet. So another way of describing derivatives is the guy, the perennial gambler who's losing at the roulette table, and rather than pay up and call it a day, he says, no, let's play double or nothing. And he loses again. And rather than having to pay, he says, no, double or nothing. Derivatives are a double or nothing approach to the massive losses which are being suffered throughout the economy. And that is the nature of the financial aggregates which have grown and which constitute the explosive charge of this hyperinflationary situation run amok, which Mr. LaRouche has been talking about.
Welcome back to this special edition of the CEC Report. Australia is supposed to be a wealthy country, but we are struggling to fund even basic healthcare services. We have a cost of living crisis, but supposedly low inflation. Watch as Dennis Small continues on the subject of hyperinflation.
Now, let me just say, the usual definitions of inflation are complete poppycock. It's nonsense. Especially if you've studied economics, it's double poppycock, because what they tell you there is, well, there's different kinds of inflation. Inflation, they say, is more money chasing fewer goods, which is ridiculous. That's not where it comes from. Or they say, well, there's cost push inflation. And what they mean by cost push inflation is that they blame the rise in prices on wages being paid to workers, and that cost is supposedly pushing the inflation. So that's just a transparent excuse for trying to cut wages further. Then there is demand pull inflation, which if you can understand that, you'll get at least 1 or 2 degrees in economics and understand absolutely nothing. Demand pull, as far as I'm concerned, is basically the economists who are pulling your leg to try to make you understand that something is going on here. That's not what is actually going on. Nor should people try to locate the existence of the hyperinflationary problem today in a simple expression of it, such as rising prices on the consumer market. It does show up there too. You do see that. You see on Obama's watch that the price of gasoline at the pump has doubled. Slight problem. You do see it in food prices at the supermarket, also soaring, because this financial bubble gets translated into the consumer economy through the speculation on derivatives in the future market and commodities and so on and so forth. But what is actually going on with the hyperinflation, think of it rather as a huge pressure cooker. And what's going on is that the buildup of hyperinflation is occurring within the financial aggregates themselves. And you can see that, for example, in this growth here. But it's a pressure cooker which is building up. At a certain point, this thing is going to blow to smithereens, at which point then you will see the transfer of this thing out into all different areas of the economy. Right now, what you have is the buildup of rapidly escalating, hyperbolically escalating financial aggregates circulating on the basis of absolutely nothing, increasing on the basis of the double or nothing principle of covering up losses. But the real problem of hyperinflation occurs when you actually go and look at this from the standpoint which Mr. LaRouche developed as a pedagogical way of understanding the process in the economy, his famous typical collapse function or triple curve, which we have here on the screen now. Now, really the only surprise in what Gross said is that people were surprised about it, because Lyndon LaRouche developed this representation back in 1995-96. So this is almost 2 decades old, LaRouche talking about the buildup of this explosive charge within the global financial system that at some point was going to blow sky high. And this was a heuristic model which he developed for presentation at a conference which he addressed in the Vatican back in that period, in the mid-1990s. Now, on the triple curve function, I mean, the thing that's most relevant here, and I think the part where people have the most difficulty in understanding what LaRouche is getting at, is you're looking at a single unified process, not 3 separate distinct curves, a single unified process where you have the growth of the financial aggregates, the growth of monetary aggregates, which at a certain point, the rate of growth exceeds the growth of the financial aggregates if you've got a cancerous bubble developing as we have today. And mind you, let me just clarify, what we're showing here is not an increase in absolute amounts. This is the rate of change. The rate of growth of the monetary aggregates exceeds the rate of growth of the financial aggregates because it's simply required to somehow or other keep this double or nothing bubble growing. But the crucial factor, and this is where LaRouche's economics is absolutely singular, is understanding the relationship of this to the third lower curve of physical economic input-output. The problem of hyperinflation is not too much money chasing too few goods. This has nothing to do with GDP or gross domestic product, because GDP does not reflect the actual physical economy. GDP is a monetary calculation based on basically what the market will bear. In other words, whatever sells. And therefore you have, for example, the International Monetary Fund stating explicitly in published documents that their argument is that drug production in countries such as Colombia must be included in the calculation of gross domestic product because it sells. If it sells, somebody wants it. That's called effective demand, and therefore it's got to be counted in GDP. So GDP is a completely phony measure. It's phony not only because its content includes actually unproductive and destructive things, such as, for example, drug production, or, for example, payments made to the economics profession for teaching at universities. That's almost as destructive as, maybe more so than the drugs, because it justifies the drugs in point of fact. But it's also false in its axiomatics. The premise of the whole thing is that there is a one-to-one monetary calculation that can be made, a monetary unit of account that can be used to describe an economy, a physical economy, where what actually is involved in a physical economy, what is really the metric that's needed against which you have a hyperinflationary blowout going, is the expansion of the productive powers of labor. The crucial question in the success or failure of a physical economy is the degree to which your policies increase the productive powers of labor. That is to say, the efficiency of man's general activity based on creative advances, science, and technology to be able to mobilize an increasingly dense energy flux, in other words, growing energy flux density through the means of production to transform man's relationship to the universe which he is a part of. And that is the actual only metric that applies to a physical economy. It's a changing metric. This is not a ruler where you can say 1 unit is 1 unit is 1 unit. It changes, and it has to change because you're talking about a dynamic process where the premise of creativity itself changes the entire parameters of the physical economy. And that's what is in fact reflected in LaRouche's triple curve here. And as Shakespeare said, in a similar context actually, the time is out of joint. You have a situation where there is a complete disjointedness between this cancerous growth of the financial aggregates, which we've seen as reflected in the derivatives, and the collapse of the actual physical economic process as reflected in energy flux density and the capability of the human species to reproduce itself at a higher level in the next period, to increase its potential relative population density.
Welcome back to this special edition of the CEC Report. Finally, watch Dennis Small expose the extent of money printing in the global financial system today and its devastating consequences.
Let's turn to the next graphic here, which tells you very clearly, it gives you a look into what the hell is going on with this policy of quantitative easing, which has been the policy not only under Obama, but prior under the Bush administration. As with all of the Bush policies, Obama has made them much, much worse. And in this case, quantitative easing, which is also what's being done in Europe through the ECB, what the Bank of Japan is now implementing, the Bank of England, and of course, helicopter Ben Bernanke's policies at the Federal Reserve. Over the 4 or 5 years from 2008, 5 years through the end of 2012, i.e. on Obama's watch, the amount of actual new funds issued by the Federal Reserve and pumped into the U.S. banking system is today over $2.5 trillion. Now, the total bailout was much bigger than that by an order of magnitude. I'm talking about the new money pumped in by the Fed with the argument of, hey, we got to help out the banks because then they'll be able to lend. Because look at what's actually happened. The quantitative easing was $2.5 trillion. Bank deposits did in fact go up over this 5-year period to about 1.6, 1.7 trillion. But was this money lent? Of course it wasn't lent. It went to play the double or nothing casino game. It was not lent out. And in fact, total bank lending, which is the red line below, dropped by $1 trillion during the same period that $2.5 trillion in new money was thrown into the banking system. So the whole thing, the whole argument, the whole Obama argument is a complete farce. It's fraudulent, patently fraudulent on the face of it. Now, it's actually much worse than this, as is the problem of the credit supernova, much worse than Gross says by at least an order of magnitude. It's a credit supernova squared. But here too, because bank lending itself is not all productive lending. In fact, a sort of a quick rule of thumb estimate is that perhaps half of that lending in any given year is productive in the economy. And the other half is completely speculative by its own rights, going into interbank lending, going into mortgage speculation, and so on and so forth. So what you're actually looking at here is a problem which is even worse than reflected in these kinds of figures. Now, I think the only way to really get a sense of how bad the situation actually is to look at the results of the policy. And I want to say one word about this because people will often say, oh, gee, the IMF policies have failed. They haven't produced what they promised they would produce. Or the Federal Reserve policies have failed, why it's led to a bad situation. I would argue the contrary. I think that the IMF policies have succeeded because the intent of their policy was to kill people. The Fed policies have been completely successful because the intent of the policy was never to bring about some sort of an economic recovery. The intent of the policy was to produce exactly the hyperinflationary bailout and genocide which it is in fact producing. So Greece today is not an IMF failure. It's a success story. They're killing them off. It's what they intended to do. The British imperial policy is depopulation, and that's what they're achieving. and they are succeeding, and they will succeed unless their entire system is replaced by Glass-Steagall. Now, let's just look, and there are many ways that one could look at the question of the physical economy, but I think really what you need to look at is the labor force. The single best way of looking at that third curve of LaRouche's, the physical economy, is to take a look at what's happening with the productive labor force. If it is the case, as it is, that the only actual source of wealth is an increase of the productive powers of labor, then clearly the most important thing you need to do in an economy is to generate not only new jobs for youth, but productive jobs for youth, and educate people and train them so that you're increasing the scientific level, the classical cultural level, the technological level, so that your energy flux density rises, and you have the basis then of actually a rise in the overall productive powers of labor. Take a look at the situation of Spain today. And I could do the same graphics for Greece, where the youth unemployment rate is 62%. In the case of Spain, you can see what has happened over the last decade or so, a little less than a decade, which is total official unemployment, which is not the actual unemployment, it's much worse, but the official unemployment of the whole labor force is in the blue bar, and that has now risen to about 26% total of the labor force, which is bad enough and horrifying enough. But if you look at what has happened to youth unemployment, you have a situation in Spain where at the end of 2012, over 50% of the youth labor force aged 18 through 24 was unemployed. And the projection is that by the end of this year, that will hit 60%. Now, in Greece, it has already hit 60%. In fact, the latest official figures from Greece are a 62% youth unemployment rate. Now, stop for a second and think about what that means. What does it mean for the actual survival of a country or an economy when close to 2/3 of your youth have been thrown on the scrap heap? They don't have a job, let alone a productive job or a high-tech job. They have no future. The country is being killed. It is being destroyed. And I ask you, what is the difference between this destruction of a country and the concentration camps of Adolf Hitler, also inspired by the British? There's absolutely no systematic difference between the two. This is genocide which is going on, and it is intentional genocide which is going on. And it's that policy that has to be changed. That's why LaRouche says that the alternatives which we're actually facing today are between a return to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Glass-Steagall principle of 1933 or genocide.
I trust you found Dennis Small's presentation to be thought-provoking. To conclude, the Glass-Steagall solution to this hyperinflation crisis means enacting the same banking separation that US President Franklin Roosevelt imposed in America during the Great Depression. Banks that hold deposits will be separated by a firewall from investment banks and therefore from the entire hyperinflationary derivatives bubble. That way, as the bubble collapses, the real economy can keep functioning. The CEC has just produced this special pamphlet, Glass-Steagall for Australia, which is everything you need to know about Glass-Steagall and how it is desperately needed to protect Australia from a banking collapse. You can get a free copy by calling 1-800-636-432. But don't just inform yourself. Join the CEC's political fight to get this solution enacted. So call the toll-free number or email us, get on our website and get involved.